King Lear is a tragedy written by William Shakespeare in the year 605 and tells the tale of a king named Lear, who decides to give away his power to his three daughters in exchange for their declaration of love. The play sees an ensuing power struggle between the kingdom, and we see King Lear descend into madness as a result of the ill treatment he believes he receives from his daughters, subsequent to his relinquishing of the throne. The play is thought to have been derived from the legend of Lear of Britain, a mythological Celtic king whose story was recounted in the pseudo-historical book History of the Kings of Britain by Geoffrey Monmouth. What's interesting about King Lear is that historically there exists more than one version. An original draft by Shakespeare in 1605, known sometimes as the quarto version, or the 1623 version, published in the First Folio, which featured a collection of revised plays. In fact, there have since been variations of King Lear, particularly after the English Restoration in the mid-17th century that implemented a happy ending for Lear and his daughter Cordelia, because the audience disliked the depressing tone of death that hits so heavily in the final scene. Typically, Lear in the quarto version and the First Folio are conflated into one story, and it is the one we most recognise today. From the beginning of the play, we learn that King Lear is elderly and wishes to retire from his royal duties. With his court in session, he divides his realm into 3 shares amongst his daughters, and states their shares will be given based on how much affection they declare for him. The eldest daughters, named Goneril and Regan, speak first and declare a few sentences about their intense love for their father, for which they receive equal portions of his kingdom. The third daughter, Cordelia, however, is unable to formulate such words. She tells her father that she loves him, but cannot speak as fluently as Goneril and Regan do. To this, Lear believes she is ungrateful, and therefore disinherits her and banishes her, dividing her share amongst her sisters. The Earl of Gloucester, known simply as Gloucester, and the Earl of Kent, known simply as Kent, see this as a foolish move on behalf of the king, because the realm is now split 50-50 between Goneril and Regan. This puts their husbands, the Duke of Albany and the Duke of Cornwall, at equal odds, and potential contenders for war, given they now own half the realm each. Kent, having been a trusted advisor and friend of King Lear, believes he is not being fair on Cordelia, who could not muster up the words to speak of her love. But Lear doesn't care. He believes Kent speaks out of line for such defense of Cordelia, and banishes him from the realm. As Kent leaves, Lear summons the Duke of Burgundy and the King of France, both of who had proposed to marry Cordelia, but upon learning that King Lear has disinherited her, the Duke of Burgundy backs out of the marriage proposal. The King of France, however, is more impressed by Cordelia's honesty, and seems to find her all the more attractive for it, despite knowing that in marrying her, he will receive none of Lear's realm. He agrees to marry Cordelia, and takes her away to France. We also see here the introduction of the main villain Edmund, the illegitimate son of Gloucester, who he introduces to Kent. With Kent banished and Cordelia taken to France, Lear tells his remaining daughters Goneril and Regan that he will live alternatively with them and their husbands. He reserves himself 100 knights that will become his travelling companions, and who will be supported, fed and housed by both Goneril and Regan when he comes to visit. Goneril and Regan agree, but privately they reveal their disdain for having to house their father, let alone his knights, and reveal that their declarations of love were fake. They no longer see their father as a king, but more so a foolish old man. Gloucester's illegitimate son Edmund, the main villain of the play, often receives his own moments with the audience, similar to Iago from Othello, where he reveals his plans to us, and how he intends to implement them. He tells the audience that he resents being a bastard, because he will never be heir to anything, and it is something he deserves a hell of a lot more than his legitimate brother Edgar, who he plots to get rid of. Edmund forges a letter that implicates his brother Edgar of planning the usurpation of Gloucester's estate, and ultimately gives it to Gloucester, who falls for the letter entirely. Edmund later finds his brother Edgar and tells him their father is outraged at something relating to him, and that Edgar should lay low for a while and keep out of their father's sight. Kent, who was dismissed by Lear, actually wants to come back. He declares that he is loyal to the king, despite having been thrown out by him, and seeks to return to his service. With Lear now staying at Goneril's house with his 100 knights, Ken puts his own plan in motion. He dons a disguise and goes by the name Caius, and is able to worm his way back into Lear's employ as a servant after having chastised one of Goneril's trusted servants, Oswald, for having offended the king. He actually trips over Oswald, and so impressed by this show, Lear hires Caius to join him, none the wiser to who he actually is. It's understood that Lear and his 100 knights become insufferable to Goneril. She lectures Lear about their presence, declaring that they are unruly and savage, and that he need not have so many in his entourage. She demands that he reduce his party's size. Enraged by his daughter's orders and unwilling to diminish his retinue by even one, Lear denounces her and departs for Regan's home instead. Amongst Lear is the character known as the Fool, and he seems to be the only one who gets away with undermining or downright insulting Lear as he proceeds to troll him, telling him that he is foolish if he thinks Regan will accept him any better than Goneril has. Meanwhile, Edmund tricks his brother Edgar into fleeing from their home, claiming that the Duke of Cornwall, who has come to visit their family home, is coming to kill him. Edgar believes his brother speaks truly, and so flees into the night. Edmund then injures himself on purpose, so as to appear as if there was a struggle. Reporting to Gloucester, Edmund tells his father that Edgar attacked him, and with conjunction of the fake letter that promised to usurp him, Gloucester labels Edgar an outlaw and legitimizes Edmund. Kent arrives at Gloucester's home as well, and seeks to bring a message from Lear that he has left Goneril's house and now seeks to come and live with her. But whilst here, Kent runs into Oswald again, the same steward of Goneril that he had pushed over, and the two have another altercation. However, Regan and Cornwall appear to break it up and seem to side with Oswald as Kent is put in the stocks and left there all night. Lear arrives the next morning and is mortified at the mistreatment of Kent. He berates Regan for treating him this way, but Regan doesn't seem to care much. She speaks to him the same way Goneril did, and like the fool predicted, doesn't welcome him with any warmer reception. Kent is freed from his bonds, but not before Goneril arrives to support her sister, as they both essentially tell Lear he shouldn't expect anything from them, that they won't wait on his disorderly nights, and that he should start acting with more grace. Lear goes the complete opposite way, and marches off outside and into a storm. Here we see him rage against the gods, with only the company of Kent and the Fool, one who tries to console him, and the other pretty much there to say "I told you so." Kent leads them through the storm and through the terrain, where eventually they stumble upon the madman Tom O'Bedlam, which actually happens to be Edgar in disguise. Lear, who is further descending into madness himself, recognizes Tom O'Bedlam as a philosopher of great wisdom, and he joins their sorrowful party as they wade through the storm towards shelter. Meanwhile, Gloucester reveals that he thinks it is wrong that Lear is being treated this way by his daughters. He tells Edmund he has word of a French invasion that has landed in Britain, and that under the orders of the King of France and Cordelia, has been designed to reinstate Lear as king. Learning of this, Edmund sees another opportunity to accelerate his master plan, and betrays his father to Cornwall, Regan and Goneril, telling them that Gloucester has been conspiring with the French to take the realm back and give it to Lear. Goneril leaves with Edmund to inform her husband Albany of this news. Gloucester is arrested by Regan and Cornwall, and under interrogation proceed to gouge out his eyes. Sickened by this, a servant strikes Cornwall and mortally wounds him. Regan then kills the servant and reveals to Gloucester that it was Edmund who betrayed him. No longer seeing him as a threat given that he has no eyes left, she pushes him out of the door and into the wilderness. Meanwhile, Edgar in his madman disguise stumbles upon his blinded father in the wilderness. Gloucester, who is sightless, fails to recognize his son and isn't able to place his voice. He begs Edgar to lead him to a cliff so that he might jump, but Edgar leads him to a small mound, and when Gloucester jumps, he doesn't fall very far and of course survives. Edgar pretends that Gloucester had survived the fall from the highest point and feigns astonishment, claiming it to be a miracle. Meanwhile, Goneril starts to find Edmund attractive, more so than her husband Albany, who she views as cowardly, given that Albany has begun to feel bad about the whole situation with Lear. He becomes disgusted by the way Goneril has treated her father, and there and then denounces his wife. Goneril sends Edmund back to Regan, but after hearing about Cornwall's death and that her sister no longer has a husband, Goneril fears Regan might try to steal Edmund from her. So she sends him a letter through her steward Oswald. Kent is successful in leading Lear to safety as he gets him into custody of the French army, commanded by Cordelia, who receives him with relief. Lear, still half mad, appears embarrassed and regretful over the way he had treated Cordelia and for his previous errors. Regan beseeches Albany to join forces with her against the French, and we see her intercept Oswald, learn of the letter sent by Goneril regarding Edmund, and proceeds to confirm her sister's suspicions. Regan too has a thing for Edmund, and she convinces Oswald that she is a far better match for him. Oswald goes looking for Edmund to pass on the message, but happens to come across Edgar and Gloucester, with who he has been tasked to kill by Regan. In an attempt to complete his mission, Oswald is slain by Edgar. Edgar inspects Oswald's pockets and finds Goneril's letter addressed to Edmund, in which she encourages him to kill her husband Albany and to take her as his wife. Regan, Goneril, Albany and Edmund meet with their army, where Albany insists that their armies fight the French, but retrieve Lear and Cordelia alive. We also learn that while the two sisters lust for Edmund, Edmund has promised himself to both, and is now posed with a dilemma. In this, he begins to plot the deaths of Albany, Lear and Cordelia. Edgar, still in disguise, approaches Albany and hands him the letter intended for Edmund that details the instructions by Goneril to kill him. The combined forces of Albany and Regan crush the French forces, and both Lear and Cordelia are captured. The British leaders meet to discuss their victory, where Regan announces that she will be marrying Edmund. Albany steals her thunder though, and reveals the letter handed to him by Edgar incriminates Edmund as a would-be assassin. He declares Edmund a traitor, and means to expose him for his devious plotting. At this moment, Regan falls ill and dies, having been poisoned off-screen by her sister Goneril, in an attempt to have Edmund for herself. Albany continues to accuse Edmund, but Edmund defends himself, and intends to clear his name via a trial by combat. It's here that a masked man appears in armour and presents himself as Edmund's challenger. They fight, but the armoured man mortally wounds Edmund and wins the trial in Albany's favour. The armoured man then takes off his mask, and it is none other than Edgar himself. Albany then confronts Goneril with the letter that she had written to order Edmund to kill him, but she flees from the scene. Edgar reveals to Edmund that their father Gloucester has died, and while we don't see this on screen, Edgar notes that Gloucester's death came about out of shock when Edgar revealed who he really was. Meanwhile, Goneril commits suicide off stage after realising her plans were thwarted, and her true love Edmund now lies bleeding out. A dying Edmund shows to do at least one redeeming act, though admits it is against his character. He speaks of orders he had given to have Lear and Cordelia killed, and that if Edgar hurries, he can stop it from happening. Albany sends his men to counter Edmund's orders, but they are too late. Edmund dies, and Lear enters the scene carrying Cordelia's corpse in his arms. He explains that he himself had survived after he'd killed his own executioner, but that Cordelia was not so lucky. Kent appears, and Lear finally recognises him, though it brings him little relief with Cordelia now dead in his arms. Albany urges Lear to retake the throne, but it appears Lear becomes too overwhelmed with all that has taken place, and he too dies where he stands. Albany turns to Kent and Edgar and asks them to take charge of the realm alongside him, but Kent declines and takes his leave. In the quarto version, it is Albany who assumes control over the realm, but in the first folio version, it is implied that it is Edgar who becomes king. Believe it or not, King Lear is actually considered to be the main protagonist of the play, despite the fact that his incessant lamenting, self-pitying, self-destructive behaviour is what most of us remember about him. He doesn't display any real heroics, doesn't act nobly, and doesn't really do anything except push away those who love him most and demonstrate the same tactics for attention that a child having a tantrum might. He even runs off into the stormy night without his coat on. If that doesn't scream attention seeker, then I don't know what does. Except maybe the way he gaudily prances about with his 100 knights, or makes a show about who will get his inheritance, or who he'll live with. Literally, everything he does requires the validation of another human being, stooping as low in fact to seek the attention of one Tom O'Bedlam, the alter ego of a crazed and naked Edgar. The conditions for which Lear's daughters have to earn their inheritance shows us what type of egomaniac we're dealing with here. He doesn't award his kingdom based on his daughters' duty, nor even their age, but instead over who can flatter him the most. Which of you shall we say doth love us most, he asks, that we are our largest bounty may extend. Here, Lear doesn't come across as a king, nor even a man of nobility. He sinks to having his ego stroked by his own daughters no less, which paints him out to be quite pathetic. He is willing to give up his kingdom for proclamations of love, and this makes me wonder how deprived this man is of affection. We never see or hear about his wife, the Queen, and so perhaps this is a sign of how lonely Lear is, that he will do anything to feel appreciated by someone. It would explain why he is so blind to the lies of Goneril and Regan, and perhaps why he gets so defensive and hateful when Cordelia declares to him, "Nothing, my lord." That she denies him of the flattery he so desperately craves causes him to respond in a most harsh manner, exiling her from the kingdom and his heart as he pawns her off to the King of France. His anger is so toxic that he even gets rid of his loyal follower Kent, who tries to defend Cordelia. Again, we see a man who is more like a spoiled child who doesn't get his way. The fact that Kent calls him out for his behaviour wounds Lear's ego so badly that he banishes him too, declaring, "Turn thy hated back upon our kingdom. If on the next day, following thy banished trunk be found in our dominions, the moment is thy death. Away." He is willing to kill one of his most devoted men simply because he disagrees with him, showing us he is not open to criticism, doesn't take resistance well, and reacts to such encounters with the utmost immaturity. It is this sort of hubris that causes Lear's downfall, for his banishing of his most loyal acquaintances in Kent and his daughter Cordelia leave him open to the scheming of his far shrewder and cunning daughters. We see the theme of hubris used quite a lot in ancient Greek tales. The idea of pride leading to one's downfall, or pride going before a fall, as the saying goes. Greek hero Bellerophon becomes so prideful he ascends to Olympus, believing he belongs there, only to be struck by Zeus and sent crashing back down to earth. The same might be said of Lear, who, with such an abundance of pride, refuses to be told no by anyone, even when he is retired from the throne and lodging with his daughters. "Darkness and devils," he tells Goneril after she calls him out for his gallant behaviour in her home. "Saddle my horses, call my train together. Degenerate bastard, I'll not trouble thee." He's blatantly in the wrong for his disrespect of her residence, and yet he still thinks he is in the right, and that Goneril is a bad daughter for not enduring him. His pride is such a reinforced element of him that he fails to even recognise the possibility that he's a bit of a dick. It is hubris that carries Lear down this stream of self-destruction, and like the Greek heroes, it eventually blows up in his face. Throughout the play, we get to see how Lear adapts to transitioning from being a king to having relatively little power over anyone other than his unruly knights. We see him react with shock when people don't obey him, a prime example being Goneril's servant Oswald, who actually ignored Lear and brushes him off. When Oswald is asked in Act 1 Scene 4 who Lear is, he replies, "My lady's father," to which sets Lear off into a rage as he says, "My lady's father, my lord's knave, you horse and dog, you slave, you cur." He then proceeds to strike Oswald, all because he did not receive the answer he wanted. At this point, you might say that Lear is slipping further into madness. He resorts to violence when he doesn't receive validation, and evidently isn't used to being told no or being corrected. He is not prepared for a life where he is not king, and cannot deal with any of the scenarios where he is seemingly wronged without responding with an emotional outburst or straight up violence. When the storm breaks out and his daughters both stand against him and his desire to maintain his knights, he tells his daughters, "I will have such revenge upon you both, that all the world I will do such things, what they are yet I know not, but they shall be the terrors of the earth." And this is reminiscent to me of a child threatening to run away from home after being told no, they can't have any more ice cream. It is nothing more than an empty threat, and everyone knows it. Lear is too old and too much of an idiot to exact revenge on anyone, and yet he spews the words with such passion that it appears he actually believes in what he is saying. And to think, this all comes about because Lear can't get his way with his knights. Interestingly, the knights aren't necessarily the problem here, it's what the knights represent. They are a symbol of his fading power, a final remnant of his once omnipotence as king, a reminder of the man he once was. By having them stripped away, it leaves him in a vulnerable place, a place he doesn't wish to go to, because there, he is no longer king, and people like Oswald are able to disrespect him as they please. They are not obliged to stroke his ego, pay him flatteries, or abide by anything he says, and for Lear, this is too scary of a reality to face. Lear intends, even in the thick of the storm, to be in charge of his destiny. Despite no longer being king, he wishes to live on his own terms, even if that means wandering the wilderness in the raging storm. You might say that by retreating into the storm is a tactical move to furthermore protect his ego from being chiseled away by his daughters. He tells us in Act 3 Scene 4, "Thou thinkest 'tis much that this contentious storm invades us to the skin, so 'tis to thee, but where the greater malady is fixed, the lesser is scarce felt. Thou dost son a bear, but if thy lay towards the raging sea, thou dost meet the bear in the mouth. When the mind's free, the body's delicate, the tempest in my mind doth from my senses take all feeling else." What he is saying here is that while the storm might seem like a big deal to everyone else, to him it is nothing, because he is going through a worse storm in his head, that he thinks his daughters have done him wrong, and that now he truly has nothing. He adds that there is a storm in his mind, and that this prevents him from feeling anything else, meaning he can endure the cold and the wind and the rain far more than he can endure being undermined and disobeyed by his daughters and his former subjects. His ego out here in the storm is therefore saved, for while he is soaked and battered by the winds, no one amongst his current and limited company of Kent and the Fool will disobey him. Ironically, here in these conditions, no one can tell him no, and here in the wilderness, he maintains some element of control. Once more though, we can see how prideful Lear is, and how immature he is, that he will not acquiesce to his daughters, and would rather stay out in the rain. Fleeing into the storm is a no-brainer for him, like the child who flees to his room, or to truant, because he cannot face the reality of what is happening around him. Despite his unlikable traits, the audience are led to feel sympathy for Lear in a number of ways. Firstly, after facing the harshness of the storm and the bitter reality that he is no longer a king, Lear begins to empathise with those who are less fortunate than him. The experiences of being poor begin to resonate with him, as in the first time in his life, he places himself in another person's shoes. Poor naked wretches, whereso you are, that bide the pelting of this pitiless storm, how shall your houseless heads and unfed sides, your looped and windowed raggedness, defend you from seasons such as these? Here Lear recognises the poor have it far harsher than he ever did, and admits he did not do enough to protect those who needed it. By experiencing pain himself, Lear is able to see himself as a poor beggar, as he begins to finally understand he's no longer king. However, you might also say that his sympathy for the poor only manifests because of his sympathy for himself, for he is now one of them. By the end of the play, we finally see some redemption for Lear, who recovers from his spell of insanity and appears to be more humbled for it. In Act 4 Scene 7, where he awakens to Cordelia, he tells her, "Pray do not mock me, I am a very foolish old man, 80 and upward, not an hour more or less, and to deal plainly, I fear I am not in my perfect mind." As can be seen, he recognises his own limitations, and at last admits he is foolish and old, something he never would have done in the first scenes of the play. He understands he is not of perfect mind, and can finally admit he is vulnerable and fallible. He immediately becomes a different character, no longer brash and childish with his interactions, and no longer seeking of flattery and subservience in every encounter. He appears to be wiser after his bout with insanity, and seeks forgiveness from Cordelia, even going as far as to admit he was wrong. "If you have poison for me, I will drink it," he tells her, showing that he would do whatever it takes to repay her for the hurt that he has caused in sending her away. Even in defeat to Edmund's army, Lear has high spirits, and despite becoming a prisoner, he doesn't lash out nor respond with heated emotion. He submits entirely to Cordelia, telling her in Act 5 Scene 3, "We two alone will sing like birds in the cage. When thou dost ask me blessing, I'll kneel down and ask of thee forgiveness." What was once a man clinging to the last vestiges of his power in the form of his knights becomes a man who is content to be a prisoner with nothing more but his daughter by his side. The saddest thing about this, of course, is right as Lear comes to realise the error in his ways, in that all his pride and hubris pushed away the one daughter who truly loved him, she too is ripped away from him. The tragedy here, of course, is that had Lear realised earlier that he could be content with just his daughter's love, he could have been happy for the rest of his days. Instead, he beholds a dead Cordelia in his arms. I believe Kent sums up Lear's fate best in Act 5 Scene 3, as he states, "If fortune brag of two she loved and hated, one of them we behold."
The Fool. While we see that Lear suffers nothing in the way of backchat, rebukes, or anyone trying to disagree with him, he does leave room for one character to essentially troll him throughout the entire play. Whilst Cordelia and Lear are banished for what some might see as the slightest insubordination, the Fool gets a free pass. It's a pretty cool parallel to the contemporary stigma of a fool's service in Elizabethan times. Fools were hired to entertain royalty with songs, dance, and comedy, but it was not uncommon for a fool to be beaten for making a mockery of the king or for causing offence. The Fool in Lear cruises through this expectation and not only mocks Lear to his face, but does the one thing that Kent, his most trusted ally, attempts to do in telling Lear why he is wrong. In fact, while Kent aims to do this diplomatically, the Fool pretty much tells Lear he is a moron, and at one point even offers Kent his own fool's hat, implying that Kent would be a fool himself to follow one as stupid as Lear. He even tells Lear to his face that he ought to get a cap himself from his daughters, who have made a mockery of him, as he states in Act 1 Scene 4, "If I gave them all my living, I'd keep my coxcombs myself. There's mine, beg another of thy daughters." In response to this, Lear does threaten to whip the Fool in one of the only times he seems to reprimand him, but the Fool sees this as no more as an empty threat, and goes on to point the illogicality of having him whipped for speaking the truth. He states, "Truth's a dog that must to kennel. He must be whipped out, when Lady Brack may stand by the fire and stink." And what he means by this is that it's foolish of Lear to have him whipped for speaking honestly, when Goneril, whose house they are in, stands there spouting false words. We get to see the wisdom of the Fool from his very first few lines, and despite being a fool, he demonstrates the chasm-wide gap between his intellect and that of both Lear and Kent. "Have more than thou showest, speak less than thou knowest, learn less than thou owest, ride more than thou goest, learn more than thou trowest, set less than thou throwest, leave thy drink and thy whore, and keep in a door, and thou shalt have more than 2 tens to a score." This is the first song that the Fool sings to Lear, and appears to be a cautionary song about being humble, about keeping to oneself, about being wary of trusting others, and about saving money. Given that this is sung to Lear, it's possibly also hiding the Fool's delivery of irony to Lear, who has not been careful, has not been humble, and has not been wary of trusting. To Kent though, the song makes no sense, thus showing how smart the Fool is, that he even has Kent baffled. The Fool then calls back to Lear's own words to Cordelia, possibly again a form of irony, as he tells Kent, "You gave me nothing for it. Can you make no use of nothing, nuncle?" Lear then confirms this without realising he's being quoted and possibly mocked, saying, "Why no, boy, nothing can be made of nothing." The Fool's disobedience and lack of regard for Lear's threats becomes so common that it would appear that Lear simply doesn't bother reprimanding him anymore. He can only hope to question the Fool as a form of rebuke, saying things like, "Dost thou call me a fool, boy?" To which the Fool amply responds, "All thy other titles thou hast given away that thou wast born with," meaning that the only title Lear has right to claim, having given away everything else, is the title of Fool. The Fool himself is a favourite of mine, not only because of how secretly smart he is, but also because of how much of a savage he is. "Thou madest thy daughters thy mothers," he insults Lear, implying that having given them his lands, they have become like mothers to him, completely in control of him and higher than him in rank. "I'd rather be any kind of thing than a fool, and yet I would not be thee, he tells Lear, showing how much pity he has for the king, and how he is glad he is not in the same predicament, nor of the same foolish mind. Now thou art a zero without a figure. I am better than thou art now. I am a fool. Thou art nothing, he continues. And this all only in his first appearance in the play. He not only destroys Lear with these attacks, but he does so calmly, without seeming too personal. It's as if he exists outside of Lear's corporeal world, like a voice in his head, telling him all the things he is unwilling to face or admit, a voice he is powerless to stop. Perhaps one of the harshest lines that comes out from the fool's mouth is one of the most honest. When Lear demands to know who he is to make a point to Goneril, the fool answers, "You're Lear's shadow." Through this, the fool appears to give voice not only to his own observations, but also the deeper and truer feelings of every other character, including those who are too nice or too loyal to say anything inflammatory about the former king. You might say it is what is most liked about the fool, that he provides a sort of social commentary throughout the play, often touching upon our own thoughts and feelings towards the characters, as he remains as much a spectator as we are. But while the fool had been keen to mock Lear in previous scenes, he becomes far more compassionate in Act 3, during the storm. He even willingly enables Lear's madness when he holds an imaginary trial for Regan and Goneril in the hut. Though being a rational man, the fact that he goes along with this roleplay all to appease Lear shows us that the fool must value him, that he pretends to be the judge in this fantasy courtroom just to satisfy his former king. This unfortunately is the last time we see the fool, perhaps because he realizes he can no longer serve a completely mad Lear, who not only ignores reason, but would probably ignore the fool's jibes and irony even more, as it would likely go over his head. The fool becomes redundant to a mad-stricken Lear, and given that he didn't listen to the fool when he was sane, it would be hard to imagine he would listen to him now. We learn by the end of the play that the fool was hanged, and again we are shown the tragedy of Lear in its fullest, as he realizes too late of his follies. Cordelia. Along with the fool, Cordelia shows us to be one of the most honest characters in the play. While she doesn't actually appear for the majority of the play, she is kept alive in the audience's mind by the other characters, and their frequent mentions of her, including her unfair dismissal, and of course by Lear's constant lamentation of how his daughters have wronged him. It is Cordelia's banishment in the beginning of the play which sets up how we feel about the protagonist Lear, and how we come to look unfavourably upon him because of his mistreatment of one so obviously honest. Her character is marked with integrity from the very beginning, as we see her refuse to play the game her sisters do in lying to Lear to obtain his riches, and we empathise with her immediately by the way we become privy to her thoughts, as she reveals her anxiety to speak of her feelings, and thus gets us on her side. We can't help but feel immediately drawn to her because it seems as if she confides in us her truest feelings she is seemingly unable to speak of to her own father. "Then poor Cordelia," she says in Act 1, Scene 1, when Lear first asks for his daughters to declare their affection. "And yet, not so, since I am sure my love's more ponderous than my tongue." Meanwhile, when it is her turn to declare her love for Lear, she simply tells him, "Nothing, my lord," because she is unable to form her love into words and does not try to lie about it like her sisters do. The King of France perceives her integrity and finds it most appealing. He shares a high opinion of Cordelia and chooses to marry her, despite knowing he will not receive any of Lear's inheritance as she is exiled. Whilst this is the last we see of Cordelia for a while, we are pleased that her earnest behaviour is met with the reward of a husband who seems honourable and honest himself. In a way, we are glad Cordelia is spared the unfolding tensions in the room, that see Kent fired and the revelation of Goneril and Regan's disdain towards their father, which foreshadow the dramatic twists of the rest of the play. That Cordelia is taken out of the scene so early gives us some hope based on her morals and love for Lear that she will return to save him at some point, and through this she takes on the role as a rescuer and a much needed aid to Lear, despite him not exactly deserving it. Still, by Act 4, where Cordelia does return, she does not demonstrate bitterness towards her father, despite having every reason to. Despite his madness, she meets him with compassion and shows him the greatest concern, as if he'd never wronged her in the first place. In this, Lear realises that Cordelia is the best of his 3 daughters, and out of all of them, it is certainly her who loves him the most. Like she tried to explain in Act 1, "You have begot me, bred me, loved me. I return those duties back as our right fit."
By this, she proves herself right in that just because one might declare their love does not make it so, but more so it is their actions that prove their truest feelings. Once more, Cordelia is a beacon of hope as she proceeds to nurse Lear back to health, and we hope he is able to find redemption as he admits his follies and begs her for forgiveness. Cordelia's portrayal as a selfless beacon of hope makes her death more devastating for the audience, and allows Lear's final act of revenge, which is killing Cordelia's hangman, to appear heroic, adding further to his terrible and tragic downfall. Lear's response to Cordelia's death finally restores his sense of good judgment for the audience, and he is redeemed. It appears he finally learns the value of true emotion and true love, albeit moments too late, and this makes the depth of his grief palpable. We can see his passionate tirade exemplify this in Act 5 Scene 3, when he unleashes upon all in attendance in the wake of Cordelia's death. "A plague upon you, murderers, traitors all. I might have saved her, now she's gone forever. Cordelia, Cordelia, stay a little. Ha! What is it thou sayest?" Her voice was ever soft, gentle and low, an excellent thing in a woman. The fact that Cordelia is killed off at all has drawn a lot of controversy, given that she is pretty much the only character that is entirely innocent and pure of heart. She doesn't do anything to harm anyone, and yet pays the ultimate price. You might say that this happens so that Lear can fully grasp the reality of his actions, and that her death serves as the final blow that sees him lose everything that he could have ever possibly cared about. The fact that Cordelia was Lear's favourite daughter, combined with the fact that she is the only one who had his back in the end, certainly makes her and her fate the true tragedy of this play. Edmund. The younger illegitimate son of Gloucester takes on the role as the main antagonist, despite not having any contact with the protagonist, Lear. It draws into question who exactly is the main protagonist of the story, given that there appears to be two very different stories running adjacently throughout the play. Lear's struggle with his realm, his mental health, and his feeling of betrayal has very little to do with Edmund, and likewise, Edmund's ambition and eagerness to usurp his father has very little to do with Lear. Despite their roles as protagonist and antagonist, they don't seem to acknowledge one another. You might liken Edmund to the likes of Iago from Othello, in that both take their time to explain their plans to the audience, both deceive and manipulate others as if they were mere pieces on the chessboard, and both ultimately get what they deserve. Unlike Iago though, Edmund is not driven by petty jealousy, but instead ambition and the will to step out from his older brother's shadow, a brother who is favoured because of his legitimacy. We learn early on that Edmund seeks recognition, and that his plot isn't established out of disdain for others, but for a more selfish need that he has, having been shunned and outcast for his heritage. Many look upon Edmund's motives favourably, and see him as a heroic character, in that he is the kind of underdog and one we sympathise with for having been forced to take a back seat all his life. His plot isn't a thirst for power, which would be typical of a villain, but instead a rebellion against the zeitgeist that deems him lesser because of his illegitimacy. We can see his frustration early on in Act 1 Scene 2, where he tells us, "Thou nature art my goddess, to thy law my services are bound, wherefore should I stand in the plague of custom and permit the curiosity of nations to deprive me, for that I am some 12 or 14 moonshines lag of a brother. Why bastard? Wherefore base? When my dimensions are as well compact, my mind as generous, and my shape as true." Through this, he seeks to point out the unfairness in the way he is treated just because he is born out of wedlock. He outlines that he doesn't lack for mental capacity, physicality, or any other aspect of life, but still he is condemned as a bastard. It becomes impossible for him to view his brother Edgar, who is to inherit everything, in a positive light, and Edgar's inheritance could be the catalyst which sets Edmund on his path of wickedness. We see how he comes to resent his brother, and Edmund outlines this in the same monologue as he singles out Edgar, saying, "Well then, legitimate Edgar, I must have your land. Our father's love is to the bastard Edmund, as to the legitimate." Fine word, legitimate. Well, my legitimate, if this letter speed and my invention thrive, Edmund the base shall top the legitimate. I grow, I prosper. Now, gods, stand up for bastards. You'll notice that he refers to him as legitimate Edgar, the word legitimate used ironically so as to exemplify his point that he, a mere bastard, will ascend and topple his brother, subverting the expectations of society itself. He implies that he is that shrewd and that cunning that his plan will succeed, even though the odds are certainly stacked against him. His final line, perhaps my favourite in the entire play, shows Edmund's conviction, and that while he is doing this primarily for himself, he also keeps in mind every other illegitimate child in the world who suffers the same fate, as he shouts, "Now, gods, stand up for bastards." He seeks to invoke the will of the gods, furthermore suggesting that he will be unstoppable in his quest. While Edmund is undoubtedly a liar and a bit of a snake in that he turns Gloucester against Edgar, has Edgar sent away under false pretenses, and lies to pretty much everyone in order to further his own goals, we see some light amongst the darkness of his character. He acquiesces when defeated by Edmund in battle, and states, "What you have charged me with, that have I done, and more, much more. The time will bring it out. 'Tis past, and so am I." Through this, we can see that Edmund realizes what he has done is wrong, and that he is remorseful for his harmful actions. Much like Lear, they both appear to learn their lessons too late, and this furthermore contributes to the tragedy of the entire story. It's here at the close of the play that we also see Edmund realize that he was loved, in spite of being a bastard. He notes that he held the affections of both Goneril and Regan, and by this, we see that he's actually quite successful in stepping out of his role as a low-life whoreson, given that he won the sentiments of two of the most powerful women in the realm. He tells us, "Yet Edmund was beloved, the one the other poisoned for my sake, and after slew herself." His final moments see him make a U-turn in terms of his morality, as he seeks to do one last good thing before his life ends. It is something that is quite rare amongst Shakespearean villains. Just look at Claudius in Hamlet, who goes through with his evil plan all the way to the end, or even Iago, who doesn't concede defeat even after his plan has been unravelled. Edmund shows a more noble and humble side to him in his final moments before his demise, as he seeks to save Lear and Cordelia from certain death. It makes one wonder that amid all of Edmund's corrupt behaviour and the immoral things he does, that this stems not from an innate sense of villainy, but instead from a frustrated and lonely part of him, that just wanted to be as legitimate as his brother Edgar. Themes: Justice and Karma. King Lear is full of brutalities and tragic disasters, some of which don't always appear to make much sense, nor seem to be warranted. Things like Cordelia's death, Gloucester losing his eyes, and even the fool being supposedly hanged often seem like too harsh of a punishment, or perhaps straight up ridiculous. The chain of terrible events does raise the question of whether there is justice in the world of Lear, and whether the characters actually reap what they sow. Due to the terrible nature of what befalls some of these characters, it leads others to consider whether the idea of justice or karma actually applies to this world, and whether the characters are merely going through a series of unfortunate and random events, as opposed to getting what they deserve. We can see this in that good characters like Cordelia pay the ultimate price, despite being mostly benign in nature, and certainly not deserving of such a tragic end. Gloucester, who funnily enough gets his eyes gouged out, yet another example of an overzealous punishment, tells us, "As flies to wanton boys are we to the gods. They kill us for their sport." And this is one of his musings that there is no justice, nor any real thing as karma, and that we are all just merely playthings of the gods, to do with as they please, whether we deserve it or not. It certainly paints the world of Lear as being incongruent with the social and moral notions of justice that many hold on to. The world Gloucester comes to believe in is a bleak one devoid of all colour, perhaps parallel to his own plight, for he is no longer able to see. But more optimistic characters like Edgar insist at the end of the play, the gods are just, showing us that he does believe in some sort of moral order. This may likely stem from the religious notions one may perceive about how the world works, in that the gods serve as karma, bringing with their judgment exactly that which someone has earned. Through this idea, the gods cannot be wrong, and so the punishments that the characters receive in Edgar's mind are totally warranted. Through this, you might see the death of good characters like Cordelia as a mercy, and not a tragedy, in that going by a religious outlook, Cordelia likely went to some eternal paradise. By this, we understand that there amongst the wickedness and madness in the play, there are also beacons of goodness, though it is tricky to determine whether good triumphs over evil by the end. We must also consider the extremities of the justice being served. While we've spoken about Gloucester being a dick to his illegitimate son Edmund, I can't say that this necessarily warrants having his eyes gouged out. You might say that Cornwall was just in doing this, because he believed that he was a traitor, but why not just kill him? Why gouge his eyes out? The justice delivered here, I believe, is far too extreme for such a crime, and is perhaps more of a reflection of Cornwall and Regan, in that their first thought of how to deal with Gloucester was to pluck out his eyes, and send him out into the wilderness to wander. It leads us to question whether Lear deserved his fate. He was a bit of a tyrant, a heartless and foolish old man who made dumbass decisions, but did he deserve to have to behold his dead daughter in his arms at the end? You might say that this was the only way to get Lear to really learn his lesson, and for the morals of the tale to really sink through the layers of his ego, but alternatively, the fact that Lear dies subsequently after this moment makes me wonder what was the point of learning this lesson for such a short time, only to die all the same. Unless of course this lesson wasn't for Lear, and was instead a lesson for the surviving characters like Edgar and Albany, who would find themselves in the leadership role thereafter. There's also a sense of political justice in that Edgar and Albany, two of the most honourable characters, end up ruling the kingdom. Given their characters, it is thought that their rule is a good one, and that the realm continues to thrive with two well-intentioned figureheads at the helm. We are left with the feeling that despite everything Edgar in particular has gone through, he gets rewarded for his valiant survival, and gives us a sense that everything will be okay, even in the wake of King Lear's death. Justice is served once more, as we see Edgar land a much higher position than he would have earned from Gloucester's inheritance, showing us that sometimes you just have to wade through the shit until you get to the gold. Reconciliation and forgiveness. As we've discussed, there is no shortage of darkness and misfortunes in King Lear, and the devastating finale is a clear example of this. The relationship between Lear and Cordelia resonates brightly by the end of the play, for it stands for so much more than just the death of a beloved daughter, but also a form of self-sacrificing love. Cordelia's ability to forgive shows us how deep her love for her father is, but it is also the lesson in humility that Lear learns that allows the pair to truly reconcile, for Lear becomes appreciative of her love and is mollified by her forgiveness. Through their reconciliation, Lear is able to experience the depth of what some might say is true love, and not the passing flatteries of others that he had once mistaken for true affection. With his ego in check, Lear matures into a man who wants only to be in his daughter's good books, even if that has to be in a prison cell. It is through this reunion that their love as father and daughter flourishes, with Cordelia even nursing Lear back to health, and this can be seen as something truly beautiful, in a realm so engulfed by horror, schemes, and death. Interestingly, Lear isn't the only father to be forgiven by his child. When Gloucester is reunited with Edgar, who he mistakes for the madman Tom of Bedlam, Edgar has every reason to leave his father to wander blindly in the wilderness. After all, Gloucester had been influenced by Edmund into hating Edgar and marking him as a criminal. Another person may have been riled and bitter towards their parent for being so gullible and condemning them to such a fate, but Edgar doesn't even entertain these thoughts. He even gives Gloucester some hope in his moment of suicide, telling his father, after tricking him into thinking he'd leapt from a great height, that, "Therefore thou happy father, think that the clearest gods, who make them honours of men's impossibilities, have preserved thee." And what he means by this is that the gods have saved his life, and therefore must have some use for him yet, despite his sightless condition and withering health. He encourages his father not to kill himself, and shows him compassion when he had right to show him wrath. The fact that father and son are able to reconcile is partly due to the maturity already developed in Edgar, something Lear only learns by the end of the play. Edgar, though, appears to be one of the more emotionally adept characters, as he also forgives Edmund after their battle, telling him, "Let's exchange charity," or "Let's put this behind us and forgive each other." Of course, in fitting with the play's motif of death, they are only able to reconcile in Edmund's dying moments, showing us again that bittersweet interaction where two people make amends only for one to be tragically torn away. Lastly, there is nihilism, something that is littered throughout the play. The nihilist rejects the idea of justice, God, religion, and karma, and asserts that life itself is meaningless, something many of the characters begin to echo. Lear tells us that, when we are born, we cry that we are come to this great stage of fools, implying that the world and life itself is just a charade, an endless performance of utter randomness. Lear, mostly in his state of madness, presents the world as a bleak void, one which is devoid of love and a mere shadow of that which we convince ourselves to be true. Gloucester has a similar feeling in his own state of madness, telling us, "As flies to wanton boys are we to the gods. They kill us for their sport," implying that while there may be gods, as mortals, our lives are inconsequential and have as much value as flies to cruel boys. A lot of the events in the play seem to adhere to this view of nihilism, where bad things seem to happen for no apparent reason. The play's tragic end is a good example of this, given that except to show Lear how wrong he was about his daughter, it offers no real lesson to anyone. Except maybe don't be an idiot and give away everything to your evil daughters. I mean, I guess there's some wisdom there, in that we shouldn't take flattery as a form of true affection, but the characters left alive seem to already know this, and are left in despair at the death of both Cordelia and Lear. Through this, you might say Cordelia dies for no reason. Heck, half the characters die for no reason, except to fit the plot's tragic theme and narrative. Gloucester even bites the dust off screen, a seemingly senseless death that doesn't do his character justice, given that he'd had his eyes gouged out. Perhaps it was a mercy, but I for one expected a more triumphant end for the blind man. The fool appears to die, again off screen, and for no particular reason except for being associated with Lear. Even Cornwall gets stabbed in the back by a sideman who Shakespeare doesn't even assign a name to, yet another random and unimaginative death. You might say that Shakespeare was trying to convey the fragility of life, and the fact that sometimes people die, sometimes in dumbass ways, like that kid from the left hand of God. Or maybe Shakespeare just wasn't that good at writing. There, I said it, come at me. But if you agree that nihilism is the way of life, and nothing we do really matters, then maybe you won't mind giving me monies. Yep, the Patreon push is upon us, which signifies the end of this video. So if you've enjoyed the journey, then feel free to donate to the cause. A simple dollar will go a long way in helping me acquire artwork, so I can keep bringing you these videos. As always, don't forget to hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe. Otherwise I'll gouge your eyes out for absolutely no real reason, and then get stabbed by some random guy in the back. And then my idiot wife will let you leave and then decide that she should have actually killed you, and so sends her sister's manslave to kill you. Man, this play was weird as